Sometimes a man runs so far from his past that he forgets the dead don't always stay buried. For most folks, discovering your family's darkest secret would be devastating enough, but imagine finding it in the form of a child's bones in your own backyard. Jedediah Rourke thought he'd found peace in Montana's mountains, with only his dog Boone for company. When Boone started digging at what looked like an ant hill, Jed expected to find nothing more than insects. Instead, he found a child's skeleton holding a locket with his family name on it. The same family he'd walked away from 20 years ago, swearing never to look back. Now the past has literally risen from the ground, and Jed must face the truth about what his family did all those years ago. But how did this child end up buried in his mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range like a slow-burning ember, casting long shadows across the valley where Jedediah Rourke had built his solitary life. 20 years of self-imposed exile had weathered him into something as permanent as the granite outcroppings, a man carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, their ancient trunks standing sentinel over a life deliberately small, deliberately hidden. At 62, Jed carried himself with the careful economy of movement that comes from decades of living. Alone, every gesture served a purpose. Every word earned its place in the sparse conversations he held with Boone, his 8-year-old border collie mix, whose mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, seemed to understand more than most people ever had. The dog had wandered into Jed's life as a half-starved pup, and they'd grown into the kind of partnership that needed no words, only trust. The cabin itself reflected its owner's practical nature, built with his own hands from logs cut on his. At property, it squatted solid and unadorned against the mountainside. No decorations adorned the walls, no photographs cluttered the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace. The only concession to sentiment was an old rocking chair that had belonged to his grandmother, the one person from his past he allowed himself to remember with anything approaching warmth. Inside, the space divided into 3 rooms, a main living area that served as kitchen, dining room, and parlor, a small bedroom, and a root cellar carved into the hillside where he stored preserved meat, vegetables from his garden, and the few supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. Books lined makeshift shelves, Thoreau, Emerson, Marcus Aurelius, and worn paperback. Westerns that he read by kerosene lamp when the mountain nights stretched long and cold. His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down a dirt road that became impassable 3 months out of the year. The small town of Millfield, population 847, provided him with coffee, flour, ammunition, and little else. The townspeople knew him as a polite but distant figure who appeared monthly for supplies, paid in cash, and never lingered for conversation. They called him the Hermit, with a mixture of respect and curiosity, understanding that some men needed the mountains the way others needed crowds. Jed's daily routine had remained unchanged for years. He rose before dawn, checked his snares and traplines, tended his garden, chopped wood, and read until sleep claimed him. In winter, he trapped beaver and marten, selling their pelts to a buyer in Missoula who asked no questions about the solitary man who lived beyond the reach of civilization. In summer, he hunted deer and elk, smoking the meat for the lean months ahead. It was a life stripped to its essential elements, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But this morning felt different. Boone had been restless since yesterday, pacing the cabin's perimeter and whining at sounds only he could hear. When they'd set out to check the snares, the dog had immediately veered off their usual path, nose to the ground, following some scent that pulled him toward the old-growth section of Jed's property, where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. "What's got into you, boy?" Jed had asked. But Boone was already 50 yards ahead, moving with the focused intensity that usually meant he'd found something significant. Over the years, the dog had led him to wounded animals, warned him of approaching storms, and once alerted him to a grizzly sow with cubs before Jed stumbled into a dangerous situation. If Boone thought something warranted attention, Jed had learned to listen. The area where Boone finally stopped wasn't remarkable in any obvious way. A small clearing, perhaps 20 feet across, ringed by ancient pines whose trunks measured 6 feet in diameter. Ferns carpeted the forest floor, and a stream gurgled somewhere nearby, hidden by the undergrowth. But Boone was transfixed by what appeared to be nothing more than a small mound of earth, roughly circular, perhaps 3 feet across, and raised, no more than 8 inches above the surrounding ground. At first glance, it looked like an anthill or perhaps a rodent burrow. The earth was darker than the surrounding soil, richer, as if something had been composting beneath the surface for a very long time. Boone circled the mound, whimpering and pawing at the edges, his behavior growing more agitated by the minute. "Easy, boy, it's just dirt." But even as Jed spoke the words, something about the mound struck him as odd. The shape was too regular, too intentional, and the earth itself felt different under his boots, softer, more yielding, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully replaced. When Boone finally began digging in earnest, Jed didn't stop him. The dog's claws threw up clods of dark soil, and within minutes he'd excavated a hole nearly a foot deep. That's when the first artifact emerged, a piece of rusted metal that Jed initially took for an old can or piece of farm equipment. But as Boone continued digging and more objects appeared, Jed's breath caught in his throat. A child's shoe, leather rotted away but the brass buckle still intact. Fragments of fabric that might once have been clothing. And then, nestled in the earth as if placed there with infinite care, the bones. Jed had seen enough death in his earlier life to recognize human remains, and these were undeniably those of a child, small, delicate, arranged in what might have been a natural sleeping position, but it was what the skeleton clutched in its tiny hands that sent ice through his veins and brought 20 years of carefully maintained peace crashing. Down around him, the locket was tarnished silver, blackened with age but still recognizable. Engraved on its surface was the Rourke family crest, a mountain peak surmounted by a star, surrounded by the Latin words Veritas et Fortitudo, truth and strength. The same crest that had adorned his father's watch, his grandfather's signet, ring, and the gates of the family estate he'd fled all those years ago. With trembling hands, Jed pried open the locket's clasp. Inside, protected by the sealed metal, was a photograph so small and faded he had to squint to make out the details. But when he did, the world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The photograph showed a man and woman he recognized immediately. His Uncle Marcus and Aunt Catherine, Marcus's wife. And between them, a child he'd never seen before, a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Jed sank back on his heels, the locket trembling in his palm. His Uncle Marcus had been his father's younger brother, a man who'd always seemed to live in the shadow of the family patriarch. Marcus had married late in life, and Jed remembered the excitement when Catherine had announced her pregnancy. But there had been complications, the family had said. The baby had been stillborn. There had been a quiet funeral, a closed casket, and Catherine had never quite recovered from the loss. Except now, holding the evidence in his hands, Jed realized that the child hadn't died in childbirth. She had lived. She had grown old enough to wear lockets and shoes with brass buckles, and somehow she had ended up buried in a carefully prepared grave in the Montana wilderness, hundreds of miles from the Rourke family estate in Colorado. The implications hit him like a physical blow. His family, the family he'd grown up believing was merely cold and distant, had been capable of something far worse than emotional neglect. They had buried a child in secret, lied about her death, and hidden the truth so completely that even 20 years later, the discovery felt like unearthing ancient history. But why? What could possibly have driven them to such an extreme? And how had this child's remains ended up on his property, in a place he'd chosen specifically because it was far from everything connected to his past? Boone whined softly, pressing his warm body against Jed's leg. The dog seemed to sense his master's distress, the way the discovery had shattered something fundamental in the careful equilibrium of their mountain life. For 20 years, Jed had successfully convinced himself that walking away from his family had been enough, that distance and silence could protect him from their influence. Now he understood that the past had followed him here, literally buried itself on his land, waiting for the right moment to surface. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pine canopy, casting the forest in shades of gold and shadow, Jed carefully gathered the child's remains and what artifacts he could find. He wrapped everything in his jacket, handling the bones with the reverence they deserved, and began the long walk back to his cabin. Boone trotted beside him, occasionally looking up with those mismatched eyes as if to say he understood that their quiet life had just become infinitely more complicated. That evening, Jed sat in his grandmother's rocking chair, the locket open in his palm, studying the faded photograph by lamplight. The child's face seemed to watch him across the decades, demanding answers he wasn't sure he was prepared to find. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Sleep eluded Jed that night like a wild animal avoiding a trap. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the child's bones arranged so carefully in their forest grave, and the haunting face in the locket photograph staring back at him with questions he couldn't answer. By 3 in the morning, he gave up the pretense of rest and sat at his kitchen table, the locket open before him, trying to piece together a puzzle that had been 20 years in the making. The photograph troubled him more than the bones themselves. Death was a natural part of mountain life. He'd buried enough animals over the years to understand that even the wilderness had its own sense of ceremony. But this child had been deliberately hidden, her existence erased from family memory with surgical precision. The more he studied her face, the more certain he became that she bore the unmistakable Rourke features. The strong jawline, the deep-set eyes, the stubborn tilt of the chin that had marked his bloodline for generations. When dawn finally broke, Jed made a decision that went against every instinct he'd cultivated during his years of self-imposed exile. He was going to make a phone call. The old rotary telephone sat in the corner of his cabin, like a relic from a previous life. He'd kept it connected more out of practical necessity than any desire for human contact. The Forest Service, occasionally, needed to reach property owners about fire conditions, and the phone company had run the line up the mountain decades ago when the previous owner had been a more social creature. Jed's hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number he'd memorized, but never used. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, gravelly with age and cigarettes. "Sheriff's Department, this is Morton." "Bill, it's Jed Rourke." The silence stretched so long that Jed wondered if the connection had been lost. Bill Morton had been his closest friend during his previous life, back when Jed had worn a badge himself and believed that justice was something that could be served by good men working within the system. They'd lost touch after Jed's exodus to the mountains, but Bill had always said the door was open if Jed ever wanted to come back to civilization. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill finally said. "Jed Rourke calling me on the telephone. Either the world's ending or you found yourself in a heap of trouble." Something like that. Jed found himself gripping the receiver tighter than necessary. "Bill, I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago. Family business." "Your family?" The tone shifted, becoming more cautious. Bill had been around during the final days before Jed's departure, had seen firsthand the kind of pressure that could drive a good man to abandon everything he'd built. "What kind of family business?" Jed looked down at the locket, at the child's face, that seemed to be pleading with him across the decades. I need to know about my Uncle Marcus and his wife Catherine, specifically about the baby they lost. You have access to death records going back 25 years? I might. Depends on what you're looking for and why. Bill's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to ask questions before making promises. This about that business with your old man? Related, maybe. I can't say more over the phone, but Bill, I found something. Something that doesn't make sense given what I was told about that baby. Another long pause. Jed could hear the familiar sounds of a small-town sheriff's office in the background. Ringing phones, radio chatter, the comfortable routine of law. Enforcement in a place where the biggest excitement was usually a drunk driver or domestic dispute. Where are you calling from, Jed? My place up in the Bitterroots, about 15 miles northeast of Millfield. Jesus, you really did disappear. Completely, didn't you? Bill's chuckle held no humor. Look, I can pull some records, but it'll take time. And if this is connected to your family's business dealings, you need to be careful. Some stones are better left unturned. The stone's already been turned, Bill. Now I need to know what's underneath it. After hanging up, Jed felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. Making that call had been crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross again, reaching back into the world he'd left behind, opening himself up to the complications and corruptions that had driven him to the mountains in the first place. But the child in the photograph deserved better than being forgotten in an unmarked grave. 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived via the rural mail carrier, addressed in Bill's careful handwriting. Jed waited until evening to open it, as if the delay might somehow soften whatever revelations it contained. The death certificate was official, complete with all the proper stamps and signatures. Baby girl Rourke, born March 15, 1995, died March 15, 1995. Cause of death listed as respiratory failure due to premature birth. Signed by Dr. Harrison Ketchum, the family physician who had delivered 3 generations of Rourke children. But attached to the death certificate was a handwritten note from Bill that made Jed's blood run cold. Jed found this in the files, but something bothered me about it, so I did some digging. Dr. Ketchum reported this death, but I can't find any hospital records of the birth. No ambulance calls to the Rourke estate on March 15th. No emergency room admissions. According to official records, this baby was born and died without ever seeing the inside of a medical facility. Also interesting, I checked the county cemetery. Records. No burial permit was ever issued for baby girl Rourke. Make of that what you will. Call me if you need more, but be careful who you trust with this information. Jed read the note 3 times before its implications fully sank in. The death certificate was a lie. The baby hadn't died in childbirth. She had lived, grown, become the child in the photograph. But somehow the family had manufactured her death, created false documentation, and then made her disappear so completely that even official records supported the fiction. But why would they go to such elaborate lengths to erase a child's existence? And how had she ended up buried on his property, hundreds of miles from the family estate? That night, Jed found himself standing in the forest clearing where Boone had made his discovery, holding a flashlight and studying the disturbed earth. The grave had been carefully prepared, he realized now. The depth was precise, the dimensions exact. Someone had taken time and care with this burial, treating it as more than a simple disposal of evidence. The child had been laid to rest with ceremony, with love even. Her clothing had been preserved as much as possible, the locket placed carefully. In her hands, this wasn't the work of someone trying to hide a crime. It was the work of someone saying goodbye. But if someone had cared enough to give her a proper burial, why the elaborate deception about her death? Why create false records and lie to the rest of the family? As Jed walked back to his cabin, Boone padding silently beside him, one possibility began forming in his mind. It was a theory so dark, so at odds with everything he thought he knew about his family, that he almost dismissed it entirely. But the evidence kept pointing in the same direction, toward a truth that would explain both the careful burial and the desperate need for secrecy. What if the child hadn't died of natural causes? What if someone in the family had been responsible for her death, and the burial on his property had been an attempt to hide not just a body, but a murder? The thought should have seemed impossible. His family had been cold, distant, more concerned with business and reputation than emotional connection, but they weren't killers. At least, he'd never believed they were capable of such violence. But then again, 20 years ago, he'd believed a lot of things about his family that had turned out to be illusions. He'd learned the hard way that wealth and respectability could hide depths of corruption that would have shocked his younger, more naive self. If they were capable of the financial crimes that had driven him away, perhaps they were capable of something even worse. Standing in his cabin doorway, looking out at the forest that had been his sanctuary for 2 decades, Jed realized that his quiet life was over. The child in the locket deserved justice, deserved to have her story told, even if it meant confronting the family he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey back into his past, back to the world of the Rorks and all their buried secrets. And this time, he wouldn't run away from what he found. The decision to leave the mountain felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Jed had spent 20 years building a life that required nothing from the outside world, and now he was preparing to abandon it for a truth that might destroy him. But as he packed his few belongings into a worn duffel bag, the child's locket weighing heavy in his shirt pocket, he knew there was no other choice. Boone sensed the change immediately, pacing the cabin with anxious energy and whining whenever. Jed moved toward the door. The dog had never been anywhere but these mountains, had never seen a paved road or heard the rumble of traffic. Taking him into the world below would be traumatic, but leaving him behind was unthinkable. They were partners in this discovery, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The old Ford pickup truck in Jed's shed hadn't been started in 3 months, but after some coaxing and a fresh battery from his emergency supplies, it coughed to life with a reluctant growl. He loaded his tools, the carefully wrapped remains of the child, and enough supplies for a week on the road. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Drive to Colorado, find his uncle, Marcus, and demand answers about the child who had been buried with such care in the Montana wilderness. The drive down from the mountains felt like traveling backward through time. First came the familiar dirt road that connected his property to the outside world, then the county highway that led to Millfield, and finally the interstate that would carry him south toward a confrontation he'd been avoiding for 2 decades. With each mile, the weight of civilization pressed down on him. Traffic lights, billboards, gas stations, and strip malls that reminded him of everything he'd left behind. Boone huddled on the passenger seat, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of the modern world. Jed kept one hand on the dog's neck, offering what comfort he could, while wrestling with his own growing anxiety. He'd forgotten how loud the world could be, how fast everything moved, how artificial it all felt after years of living by the rhythms of the seasons. His first stop was a motel outside of Denver, a clean but unremarkable place where he could gather his thoughts and make the phone calls he'd been dreading. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and strangers' lives, a stark contrast to the pine-scented air of his cabin. Boone refused to eat, curling up in the corner with his back to the unfamiliar space. Jed spread the materials Bill Morton had sent him across the motel's small table, along with documents he'd retrieved from a safety deposit box he'd maintained in Missoula, insurance against the day when his past might catch up with him. Property deeds, family photographs, legal papers from the estate settlement that had divided the Rourke holdings after his grandfather's death. Everything painted a picture of a wealthy, prominent family with business interests spanning 3 states and a reputation that opened doors throughout the Mountain West. The Rourke family compound sat on 500 acres outside of Copper Creek. Colorado, a small town that existed primarily to serve the needs of the wealthy families who had built estates in the surrounding hills. Jed's father had been the eldest son, inheriting the main house and the family's mining operations. Uncle Marcus had received a smaller property on the western edge of the compound, along with responsibility for the family's real estate investments. From his motel room, Jed called information and obtained Marcus's current phone number, then sat staring at it for nearly an hour before working up the courage to dial. The phone rang 6 times before a woman's voice answered, thin and tired in a way that spoke of years of disappointment. Rourke residence. Catherine, this is Jed. The silence stretched long enough that he wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor he didn't remember from their brief interactions years ago. Jed? My God, we thought. You were dead. Marcus tried to find you after your father passed, but you just vanished. I needed to get away from all that. He gripped the phone tighter, forcing himself to stay calm. Catherine, I need to ask you about something. About the baby you lost. The sound that came through the line might have been a sob or a sharp intake of breath. Why would you want to know about that? It was so long ago. I found something. Something that suggests maybe she didn't die the way the family said she did. I can't talk about this over the phone. Her voice had become barely a whisper. If you want answers, you'll have to come here. But Jed, be careful. There are things about this family that you never knew, things that Marcus has spent years trying to forget. The line went dead, leaving Jed staring at the receiver with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Catherine's reaction confirmed what he'd already suspected. There were secrets surrounding the child's death, secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. That evening, he called Bill Morton to report his progress and request additional backup information. Bill's voice carried the strain of a man who'd been doing research he'd rather avoid. I've been digging deeper into your family's business dealings around the time that child was supposedly born, Bill said. Found some interesting connections. Your Uncle Marcus was involved in a real estate development deal that went bad in 1995. Several investors lost significant money, and there were allegations of fraud that never quite stuck. One of the investors was a man named Thomas Brennan, and he had some very unpleasant associates. What kind of associates? The kind that handle problems permanently. Brennan died in a car accident about 6 months after the development deal. Collapsed, but before he died, he was making noise about taking down everyone connected to the project, including your uncle. Jed felt the pieces beginning to form a pattern, though the picture they created was too terrible to fully accept. You think someone killed Brennan to keep him quiet? I think your family was involved in something that attracted very dangerous attention, and I think that child might have gotten caught in the crossfire. After hanging up, Jed sat in the sterile motel room with Boone pressed against his leg, trying to process the implications of what Bill had discovered. The child in the locket might not have been killed by his family. She might have been killed because of them. And someone who loved her enough to give her a proper burial had hidden her body in the one place they thought it would never be found, on property owned by the family member who had already walked away from everything. The next morning, Jed loaded his truck and pointed it toward Copper Creek. The drive would take 4 hours through mountain passes and valleys he'd once known like his own backyard. As the miles passed beneath his wheels, he found himself remembering details from his childhood, fishing trips with his grandfather, family gatherings that always seemed more like business meetings, the gradual realization that the Rourke name carried weight that came from sources he'd never fully understood. Now, armed with evidence of a child's hidden death and growing suspicions about his family's criminal connections, he was returning to face whatever truth had been buried along with those small bones in his mountain sanctuary. The man who had fled 20 years ago had been naive enough to believe that distance could protect him from his family's corruption. The man driving toward Copper Creek understood that some truths demanded to be faced, no matter the cost. The town of Copper Creek hadn't changed much in 20 years, though it felt smaller somehow, less imposing than the place that had loomed so large in Jed's childhood memories. Main Street still boasted the same mix of upscale boutiques and restaurants that catered to wealthy residents, while the working-class neighborhood sprawled up the hillsides like an afterthought. The Rourke name still appeared on half the commercial buildings downtown, a testament to the family's enduring influence in a community that had grown up around their money. Jed parked his dusty pickup truck in front of Murphy's Diner, a place that had served the town's blue-collar population for as long as he could remember. It felt like neutral ground, somewhere he could gather his thoughts before facing the compound that had once been home. Boone remained in the truck, still overwhelmed by the alien environment of paved streets and constant traffic. The diner's interior was exactly as he remembered. Red vinyl booths, a chrome counter, and the perpetual smell of coffee and bacon grease. But the woman behind the counter was new, a middle-aged redhead with tired eyes who looked up when the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a pot without waiting for his answer. "Please." Jed settled onto a stool at the counter, grateful for the familiar ritual of ordering food in a place where no one knew his name or his history. "And whatever you recommend for breakfast." She poured his coffee and studied his face with the frank curiosity of someone who'd lived in a small town long enough to recognize every regular customer. "You look familiar. You from around here?" "Used to be. Long time ago." "Well, welcome back." She slid a laminated menu across the counter. "Though, I have to say, you picked an interesting time to return. The whole town's been buzzing about the Rourke family drama." Jed's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. "What kind of drama?" "Old Marcus Rourke's been acting strange lately. More strange than usual, I mean. He was always a bit odd, but the past few weeks he's been coming into town asking questions about people who've been dead for 20 years. Made such a scene at the library that they had to ask him to leave." The news hit Jed like a physical blow. If Marcus was investigating the past, it meant he knew something about the child's death was coming to light. But how could he have known about Jed's discovery when they hadn't spoken in 2 decades? "What kind of questions?" Jed asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The waitress glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "Questions about some businessman who died in a car wreck back in the 90s. Fellow named Brennan, I think." Marcus kept insisting. "The crash wasn't an accident. Wanted to see old newspaper reports and police files. Librarian told him he'd need a court order for that kind of information." Thomas Brennan, the same man Bill Morton had mentioned, the investor who'd lost money in Marcus's failed development deal and had been making threats before his convenient death. If Marcus was investigating Brennan's accident after all these years, it suggested the 2 deaths were connected in ways Jed was only beginning to understand. After finishing his breakfast, Jed drove through the familiar streets toward the family compound, each turn bringing back memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The main gate still bore the Rourke family crest, though the ironwork looked older now, touched with rust that spoke of declining attention to detail. The guardhouse was empty, its windows dark, another sign that the family's influence had waned in his absence. The compound itself sprawled across 500 acres of prime mountain real estate, with the main house sitting on a rise that commanded views of the entire valley. Jed's father had built it as a monument to the family's success, a sprawling Victorian mansion with more rooms than any family could reasonably use. Marcus's house sat a half-mile away, a more modest structure that had always seemed to crouch. In the shadow of its grander neighbor, Jed drove past the main house without stopping. His father had been dead for 5 years, according to the obituary he'd found online, and the property now belonged to his cousin David, who had never shown much interest in family history or buried secrets. The answers he needed lay with Marcus and Catherine in the smaller house where a child's death had been carefully concealed for more than 2 decades. Marcus's house showed signs of neglect that spoke of financial strain or simply the exhaustion that comes with carrying guilty secrets. For too long, paint peeled from the shutters, weeds grew between the flagstones of the front walk, and one of the porch columns tilted at an angle that suggested structural problems below the surface. Jed sat in his truck for several minutes, studying the building, and trying to prepare himself for a conversation that would either provide answers or destroy what remained of his faith in his own family. Through a window on the ground floor he could see movement. Someone pacing back and forth in what had once been the living room. When he finally approached the front door, it opened before he could knock. Marcus Rourke stood in the doorway, 20 years older but still recognizable, his once dark hair now completely grey, and his face marked by lines that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. He was thinner than Jed remembered, almost frail, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him his father's most trusted advisor. "I wondered when you'd come," Marcus said, stepping aside to allow Jed entry. "Catherine said you'd called, asking about the baby. I've been expecting this conversation for 20 years. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Marcus had been waiting for this moment, had known that someday the truth would surface and demand a reckoning. The question was whether he would be willing to provide the answers Jed needed, or whether the family's tradition of silence and secrets would prove stronger than blood. Inside, the house felt hollow, as if too many important conversations had been avoided for too long. Catherine appeared in the hallway, moving like a woman decades older than her actual age. She looked at Jed with eyes that held both hope and terror, as if his presence might finally provide absolution for sins that had been eating at her soul. "Show him," she said to Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show him what we've been hiding all these years. It's time." Marcus nodded slowly, then turned toward a door that led to what Jed remembered as his uncle's study. "Come on then. But understand, once you know the truth, there's no going back to your mountain sanctuary. Some knowledge changes everything." As they walked toward the study, Jed's hand instinctively moved to the locket in his pocket, feeling the weight of the child's photograph against his chest. Whatever Marcus was about to reveal would either explain her death or plunge the family into an even deeper darkness. Either way, the reckoning had finally begun. Marcus's study had always been a sanctuary of sorts, lined with law books and business ledgers that reflected his role as the family's financial advisor. But as he led Jed through the familiar room toward a wall of built-in bookshelves, it became clear that the space held secrets that went far beyond simple record-keeping. Marcus stopped in front of a section of shelving that looked identical to the rest, running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes until he found what he was looking for. With a soft click, a hidden mechanism engaged, and an entire section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow room that Jed had never known existed. "Your grandfather had this built during Prohibition," Marcus explained, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "Originally it was for hiding liquor from federal agents. Later it became a place for keeping family business that couldn't see the light of day." The hidden room was small, perhaps 8 feet square, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, and a small desk sat in the center, its surface covered with documents and photographs that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. The photographs were surveillance shots, grainy black-and-white images that appeared to have been taken with a telephoto lens. They showed a man Jed didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. But it was the date stamps on the images that made Jed's stomach lurch. March 1995, just days before a child's supposed death. "Thomas Brennan," Marcus said, following Jed's gaze, "the investor who threatened to destroy our family unless we paid him back the money he'd lost on our failed development project. He had evidence of fraudulent practices, forged documents, bribery, enough to send your father and me to prison for 20 years. Jed picked up one of the photographs. studying Brennan's face and trying to understand the connection to the child whose bones he'd found in his mountain sanctuary. "So you had him killed?" "No." Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "We hired someone to watch him, to gather information we could use as leverage. But the man we hired, Viktor Kozlov, had his own agenda. He was supposed to be surveillance only. But when Brennan started making more specific threats about going to the authorities, Viktor took matters into his own hands." From one of the filing cabinets, Marcus withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. Inside were contracts, payment records, and correspondence that painted a picture of a family desperate enough to make deals with dangerous people. The name Viktor Kozlov appeared repeatedly, along with references to services that were described in deliberately vague terms. "Kozlov was a fixer," Marcus continued, his hands trembling as he sorted through the papers. "Someone the wealthy families in this region used when legal solutions weren't sufficient. He had a reputation for solving problems permanently, and we thought we could control him, use his services without getting our hands dirty." Jed found himself studying a photograph that showed a different side of the story, a candid shot of a little girl playing in a garden, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she chased a butterfly. The same child from the locket, but alive, vibrant, full of the joy that only children possess. "This is her," Jed said, holding up the photograph. "The child I found, your daughter." Marcus's composure finally cracked, and he sank into the desk chair with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Rourke, and she was the most beautiful thing Catherine and I ever created. The admission hung in the air like a confession, confirming what Jed had already suspected but hoped wasn't true. The child in the grave wasn't just some distant relative. She was Marcus's own daughter, hidden and eventually killed because of the family's criminal entanglements. "Tell me what happened," Jed said, his voice gentle but firm. "All of it." Marcus wiped his eyes and took a shuddering breath before continuing. "Brennan discovered that we were using Kozlov's services. He had photographs of meetings recorded, phone conversations, enough evidence to prove that the Rourke family was connected to organized crime. But instead of going to the police immediately, he decided to use the information as leverage. From another folder, Marcus produced a letter written on expensive stationery in Brennan's distinctive handwriting. The demands were specific and chilling. $5 million in untraceable payments, or Brennan would release evidence that would destroy not just the family's business interests, but their freedom as well. "We didn't have that kind of liquid capital," Marcus said. "The failed development deal had left us overextended, and liquidating assets would have taken months. So we went to Kozlov for help, thinking he could find some other way to neutralize Brennan's threat." The next photograph in the sequence showed Brennan's car after the accident that had claimed his life, a twisted mass of metal at the bottom of a ravine, with skid marks on the mountain road that suggested he'd lost control. On a curve. But according to the police report Marcus had obtained, there were no mechanical failures, no evidence of driver impairment, nothing to explain why an experienced driver would have crashed on a road he'd traveled countless times. Kozlov made. "It looked like an accident," Jed said, understanding beginning to dawn. "But Brennan had anticipated that possibility," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd told his business partners that if anything happened to him, they should look very carefully at the Rourke family, and he'd hidden copies of his evidence in multiple locations, with instructions for their release if he died under suspicious circumstances. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a letter from Brennan's lawyer, dated 3 days after the businessman's death. It informed the Rourke family that Brennan's evidence would remain sealed unless his demands were met posthumously. But those demands had changed. Instead of money, Brennan's final message required something far more personal and horrifying. "He wanted one of our children," Marcus said, the words coming out like a physical wound. as insurance against future retaliation. He said if we gave him Sarah for a year, he would destroy the evidence and never bother us again. If we refused, the evidence would go to the FBI. Jed felt the room spinning around him as the full scope of the horror became clear. You gave your daughter to a dead man's associates? We thought we could protect her, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. We thought we could control the situation, make some arrangement that would keep her safe while satisfying Brennan's demands. But Kozlov had other ideas. The final photograph in the collection showed Sarah's small body being carried through a forest that looked disturbingly familiar. In the background, Jed could make out the distinctive rock formations that marked the boundary of his own property in Montana. Kozlov said the safest place to hide her was on land owned by family members who had already disappeared from public view, Marcus explained. Your property was perfect, isolated, rarely visited, owned by someone who had no connection to our current business dealings. He promised us she would be safe there, that we could retrieve her once the heat died down. But Sarah had never been meant to be retrieved. The burial site had been too carefully prepared, too permanent for a temporary hiding place. Someone had killed the child and buried her with ceremony, treating her death as a final solution rather than a temporary inconvenience. As Jed stood in the hidden room, surrounded by evidence of his family's descent into criminality and murder, he realized that the child he'd found had been both victim and pawn in a game that had consumed everyone it touched. Now the question was whether 20 years had been enough time for the killers to feel safe, or whether his discovery would set in motion a new round of violence designed to keep the truth buried forever. The weight of Marcus's confession settled over the hidden room like a suffocating blanket. Jed found himself gripping the edge of the desk, trying to process the magnitude of what his family had done. Not just the criminal activities that had attracted Brennan's attention, but the willingness to sacrifice an innocent child to protect their own interests. There's more, Marcus said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. The arrangement with Kozlov didn't end with Sarah's death. It never ends with men like him. From the deepest drawer of the filing cabinet, Marcus withdrew a ledger bound in black leather, its pages filled with entries that spanned more than 20 years. The handwriting was meticulous, recording payments, dates, and services rendered, in a code that spoke of long practice in hiding criminal transactions. Viktor Kozlov didn't just solve our problem with Brennan, Marcus explained, opening the ledger to reveal columns of figures that represented thousands of dollars changing hands. He made us partners in his operation. Once you're connected to someone like him, once he's solved a problem of that magnitude, you become part of his network whether you want to or not. The entries showed a pattern of escalating involvement that painted a picture of a family slowly consumed by their criminal associations. What had started as a desperate attempt to avoid prosecution had evolved into a systematic partnership with organized crime, with the Rourke family providing money laundering services, property for hiding illegal activities, and cover for operations. That spread across 3 states. Your father knew? Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Your father was the one who introduced us to Kozlov, Marcus replied, his admission carrying the weight of a final betrayal. He'd been using the man's services for years, dealing with labor disputes at the mines, eliminating environmental activists who were threatening our permits, making problems disappear before they could damage the family's reputation. The revelation hit Jed like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years believing that his father's crimes had been limited to financial fraud and political corruption, sins that were serious but somehow understandable in the context of business competition. The idea that his father had been involved in murder, that he'd built the family fortune on a foundation of violence, shattered the last remnants of respect Jed had maintained for the man who'd raised him. But it was the next entry in the ledger that made his blood run cold. Dated just 3 months ago, it recorded a payment of $50,000 for Montana consultation services. The description was deliberately vague, But the timing couldn't be coincidental. "He knows," Jed said, pointing to the entry. "Kozlov knows I found the body." Marcus nodded miserably. "We've been watching the property through satellite surveillance and local contacts for 20 years, making sure the burial site remained undisturbed. When the monitoring equipment detected unusual activity near the grave, Kozlov demanded payment for an assessment of the security situation. The implications were staggering. Not only had his family used his property as a burial ground without his knowledge, they'd been spying on him for 2 decades, treating his mountain sanctuary as just another piece of real estate in their criminal empire. Every moment of peace he'd thought he'd found had been an illusion, monitored and managed by the same people who'd killed a child and buried her secrets in his backyard. "Show me the monitoring reports," Jed demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Marcus flinch. The surveillance files were extensive, documenting his daily routines with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operation. They knew when he went to town for supplies, when he checked his traplines, even when he sat on his porch reading in the evenings. Photographs taken with telephoto lenses showed him working in his garden, walking with Boone, living what he'd believed was a private life under the constant observation of his family's criminal associates. But it was the most recent report that made his hands shake with rage. Dated just 2 weeks ago, it included photographs of Boone digging at the burial site, detailed analysis of the disturbed earth, and recommendations for immediate containment protocols to prevent the discovery from becoming public knowledge. "They're coming for me," Jed said, the certainty of it hitting him like ice water, "and for anyone else who knows about this. That's why we had to tell you everything," Catherine said from the doorway, her voice startling both men. She'd been standing there listening, her face pale but determined. "Victor called yesterday. He's sending someone to deal with the situation permanently." The woman who entered the hidden room was not the frail, broken figure Jed remembered from their phone conversation. This, Catherine moved with purpose, carrying herself like someone who'd made peace with terrible decisions and was prepared to face their consequences. "How long do we have?" Jed asked. "His man is already in Montana," Catherine replied. "Someone called the Millfield Sheriff's Office this morning, asking questions about property ownership records in your area. They used a federal marshal's credentials, but when Sheriff Morton checked with the actual U.S. Marshals Service, no one had authorized any investigation. Bill Morton, Jed's friend, was in danger because of his willingness to help with research. That had seemed harmless at the time. The circle of people at risk was expanding, and Victor Kozlov's reputation suggested that witnesses and loose ends didn't survive long enough to become problems. "We have to get to Bill before they do," Jed said, but Catherine was already shaking her head. "It's too late for running," she said, producing a manila envelope from beneath her jacket. "Victor's been planning for this possibility for 20 years. He has contingency plans that include eliminating anyone connected to the original situation, including us and including that sheriff who's been asking inconvenient questions." The envelope contained what appeared to be a death warrant disguised as a business proposal. Victor Kozlov's organization had prepared a comprehensive plan for cleaning up the Montana situation, complete with methods for disposing of witnesses, covering up the evidence, and ensuring that the truth about Sarah's death would remain buried forever. But Catherine's next words offered the first glimmer of hope Jed had felt since discovering the child's remains. "However," she said, her voice carrying steel that he'd never heard before, "we've been preparing for this day as well. For 20 years, Marcus and I have been documenting everything, every payment, every crime, every connection between Victor's organization and families like ours. We've been building a case that could bring down his entire network." From a hidden compartment in the floor, Marcus retrieved a metal briefcase that seemed to pulse with dangerous potential. Inside were copies of financial records, recorded phone conversations, photographs of criminal activities, and sworn statements from other families who'd been caught in Victor's web of corruption and violence. "We can't bring Sarah back," Marcus said, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. "But we can make sure her death finally serves a purpose. We can destroy the organization that killed her and prevent them from harming anyone else." As Jed studied the evidence that could either save them or get them all killed, he realized that his quiet life in the mountains was truly over. The choice before him was simple but terrifying: run again and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, or stand and fight against an enemy that had been 20 years in the making. The child in the locket deserved justice. Bill Morton deserved protection. And somewhere in Montana, a killer was already making his way toward the mountain sanctuary that had been Jed's home for 2 decades. It was time to stop running. The briefcase of evidence sat between them like a loaded weapon, its contents representing both salvation and damnation for everyone in the room. But as Jed studied the photographs and documents that Marcus and Catherine had assembled over 20 years, a nagging inconsistency began to eat at the edges of his understanding. "Something doesn't add up," he said, holding up a surveillance photograph that showed Sarah playing in the garden behind Marcus's house. This was taken in March 1995, according to the date stamp, but you said Brennan's demands came after his death, which was also in March. Marcus and Catherine exchanged a look that carried the weight of 20 years of shared secrets, and Jed realized that even in their confessions, they'd been holding something back. "Show him the real timeline," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He deserves to know everything." With trembling hands, Marcus withdrew a final folder from the briefcase, one that had been hidden beneath all the other evidence. Inside were documents that reframed everything Jed thought he understood about his family's crimes and his niece's death. The medical records were authentic, bearing the letterhead of Denver Children's Hospital and signed by doctors whose credentials Jed could verify. They told a story that was both heartbreaking and infinitely more complex than the version Marcus had initially provided. Sarah Elizabeth Rourke had indeed been born on March 15, 1995, but not to Marcus and Catherine. The birth certificate listed her parents as David Rourke, Jed's cousin, and a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had worked as a housekeeper at the family compound for 3 years before becoming pregnant with David's child. David was only 19, Marcus explained, his voice heavy with old pain. Elena was 32, married to one of our groundskeepers, and terrified of what would happen if her husband discovered the affair. When she found out she was pregnant, she came to Catherine and me for help. The next document was a private adoption agreement, hastily drawn up by the family's lawyers and signed by all parties involved. David would relinquish his parental rights. Elena would receive a substantial financial settlement and relocation assistance, and Marcus and Catherine would raise the child as their own. To protect everyone involved, the official records would show Marcus and Catherine as the biological parents. "We thought we were doing the right thing," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "Elena wanted her daughter to have opportunities she couldn't provide, and we'd been trying to have children for years without success. Sarah was a gift to all of us." But the arrangement had attracted the attention of Elena's husband, Miguel Vasquez, who discovered the affair and the pregnancy despite everyone's efforts at secrecy. The police reports painted a picture of an increasingly violent man who'd made threats against both David and the Rourke family, demanding money and revenge for what he saw as the theft of his wife and the dishonor of his marriage. Miguel went to Thomas Brennan with information about David's relationship with Elena, Marcus continued. "Brennan was already investigating our business practices, and the story of a wealthy young man impregnating his employee's wife was exactly the kind of scandal he could use as leverage." The timeline that emerged from the documents was far more sinister than Jed had imagined. Brennan hadn't simply been an investor seeking compensation for financial losses. He'd been building a comprehensive case against the Rourke family that included fraud, corruption, and personal scandals that would have destroyed their reputation even if they'd avoided criminal prosecution. Brennan's real goal was to take over our entire operation, Marcus said, producing a contract that outlined the businessman's ultimate demands. He wanted controlling interest in the mining companies, ownership of prime real estate holdings, and placement of his own people in key positions throughout our organization. The financial losses from the development deal were just his excuse for declaring war on our family. Sarah had become a pawn in this larger conflict, but not in the way Jed had initially understood. The child's existence represented proof of David's affair with a married employee, which Brennan could use to claim the family had engaged in sexual harassment, abuse of power, and exploitation of vulnerable workers. In the political climate of 1995, such allegations could have destroyed the Rourke name permanently. "So you had Brennan killed to protect the family's reputation," Jed said, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "We never ordered Brennan's death," he insisted. "That was Victor Kozlov acting on his own initiative. We'd hired him for surveillance and intimidation, but when he learned about Brennan's comprehensive investigation, he decided that permanent solutions were necessary." The police report on Brennan's accident included details that had been overlooked at the time, but took on new significance in light of Victor's involvement. Witnesses had seen a second vehicle near the crash site, and there were tire marks that suggested Brennan's car had been forced off the road rather than losing control naturally. But the investigation had been cursory, influenced by the Rourke family's political connections and Victor's ability to manipulate evidence. "After Brennan died, we thought the threat was over," Catherine said, but Victor had a different perspective. He'd researched our family thoroughly, and he knew that loose ends had a way of becoming problems later. He said Sarah represented an ongoing vulnerability, living proof of the scandal that had motivated Brennan's investigation. The final revelation came in the form of a recorded phone conversation, preserved on an ancient cassette tape that Marcus had hidden for more than 2 decades. Victor Kozlov's voice was heavily accented but coldly professional as he explained his solution to the Sarah problem. "The child knows too much about the family's business." Victor's voice crackled through the old speakers. "She has seen meetings, heard conversations, observed activities that could be dangerous if she ever decides to talk. Children remember more than adults realize, and they often speak without understanding the consequences." But Sarah hadn't simply been a witness to criminal activities. She'd been present during a meeting between Victor and Marcus where they'd discussed the details of Brennan's murder. At 5 years old, she'd been playing quietly in the corner while the adults conducted business they'd assumed she couldn't understand. But children's minds work differently than adults expect, and Victor had realized that Sarah possessed knowledge that could eventually destroy them all. He said the only permanent solution was to make sure she could never testify against anyone, Marcus said, his voice breaking with the weight of his confession. But he promised it would be quick, painless. He said she would simply disappear, and everyone would assume she'd been kidnapped by strangers. Instead, Victor had staged the elaborate deception about Sarah's death in childbirth, using his connections with corrupt medical professionals to create false documentation and cover up the child's murder. The burial on Jed's property had been Victor's final touch, placing the evidence on land owned by a family member who'd already fled from criminal associations, ensuring that even if the body was eventually discovered, it would implicate the Rourkes in yet another crime. "But why didn't you go to the police?" Jed demanded. "Why did you let him get away with murdering your daughter?" The answer came in the form of a photograph that showed Marcus and Catherine's house surrounded by armed men with a note attached that spelled out Victor's insurance policy in brutal detail. If they ever betrayed him or attempted to expose his organization, their deaths would be slow, public, and designed to send a message to other families who might consider similar betrayals. "We've been prisoners for 20 years, Catherine said. "Simply Prisoners who helped build our own jail. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Jed realized that Sarah's death had been just the beginning of Victor's control over his family. The criminal organization had used the murder as leverage to expand their operations, turning the Rorks into unwilling partners in crimes that spanned decades and touched hundreds of lives. But the evidence in the briefcase represented more than just documentation of Victor's crimes. It was a comprehensive map of his organization's structure, finances, and vulnerabilities. Marcus and Catherine had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, gathering information that could bring down the entire network if it ever reached the right authorities. The question now was whether they could survive long enough to deliver that information to people who could act on it. Because somewhere in Montana, Victor's assassin was already closing in on the mountain sanctuary where this entire nightmare had begun, and time was running out for everyone who knew the truth about Sarah Elizabeth Rourke. The weight of Sarah's true story settled over them like a death sentence. Jed stared at the evidence scattered across Marcus's desk, understanding that they now possessed information that could destroy Victor Kozlov's organization if they lived long enough to use it. But first, they had to warn Bill Morton and somehow get ahead of a professional killer who had a 20-year head start on covering his tracks. "We need to move fast," Jed said, already mentally calculating the drive time. "Back to Montana. If Victor's man is already asking questions in Millfield, Bill could be in immediate danger." Marcus was frantically stuffing documents back into the briefcase, his hands shaking with a combination of fear and determination. "There's something else you need to know. Victor doesn't just send one man for operations like this. He sends a team, and they don't leave witnesses." Catherine produced a cell phone from her purse, one of those disposable models that couldn't be easily traced. "I've been in contact with someone at the FBI for the past 6 months. Agent Sarah Chen. We named our daughter after her, though she doesn't know that. She's been investigating Victor's organization as part of a larger task force on organized crime in the Mountain West." The irony wasn't lost on Jed that an FBI agent named Sarah might be their salvation in a case that had started with another, Sarah's murder. But as Catherine dialed the number, he could see the doubt in her eyes. 20 years of living under Victor's threats had taught her not to trust anyone completely, even law enforcement. "Agent Chen, this is Catherine Rourke. We talked about the Kozlov situation. Yes, it's happening now. They're moving to eliminate witnesses in Montana, and we have the evidence package ready for transfer." Catherine listened for a moment, then covered the phone and whispered to Jed and Marcus. "She says they've been tracking unusual activity around Victor's organization for the past week. Multiple operatives have gone dark, which usually means they're preparing for a major operation." While Catherine continued her conversation with Agent Chen, Jed tried calling Bill Morton's office, only to reach an answering machine with a message that sent chills down his spine. "Sheriff's office is temporarily closed due to an ongoing federal investigation. For emergencies, contact the state police." "They got to him first," Jed said, his worst fears confirmed. "Or they're using him as bait." Marcus looked up from the briefcase, his face pale but resolute. "Then we go to Montana and finish this. We can't let Sarah's death be meaningless, and we can't let them kill more innocent people to protect their secrets." The plan that emerged from their desperate strategizing was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. They would drive to Montana in 2 vehicles, Marcus and Catherine in their sedan with the evidence briefcase, Jed in his pickup truck with Boone, and the tactical advantages that came with knowing the terrain intimately. Agent Chen would coordinate with other federal agencies to establish a perimeter around Victor's known associates, while local law enforcement would be kept in the dark until the operation was complete. But as they prepared to leave Copper Creek, Catherine made one final revelation that changed everything. "There's someone else you need to know about," she said, her voice heavy with 20 years of guilt. "Elena Vasquez didn't just disappear after Sarah's birth. Victor killed her too 3 months later, to make sure she could never corroborate the truth about David's affair or Sarah's parentage. The news hit Jed like a physical blow. Elena had been an innocent woman, caught in the crossfire of his family's criminal associations, murdered simply because she'd given birth to the wrong man's child at the wrong time. Her death added another layer of urgency to their mission. Not just justice for Sarah, but acknowledgement of all the lives Victor's organization had destroyed in service of the Rourke family's secrets. The drive back to Montana felt like traveling through a landscape of memories and regrets. Every mile marker reminded Jed of the 20 years he'd spent believing that distance could protect him from his family's corruption. Now he understood that corruption had followed him to his mountain sanctuary, had literally buried itself in his backyard, waiting for the moment when the past would demand its reckoning. They stopped only once, at a truck stop outside of Denver, where they could coordinate with Agent Chen and receive updates on the federal investigation. The news wasn't encouraging. Satellite surveillance had detected multiple vehicles converging on the Millfield area, and communications intercepts suggested that Victor's team was preparing for what they called a comprehensive cleanup operation. How many men are we talking about? Jed asked Agent Chen during their brief phone conversation. At least 6, possibly more. These aren't street criminals. They're military-trained professionals with access to sophisticated equipment and unlimited resources. The Bureau is mobilizing a tactical response team, but they're still 4 hours out from your location. 4 hours was too long. If Victor's men had Bill Morton, if they were already positioning themselves around Jed's property, 4 hours could mean the difference between justice and a massacre that would eliminate all witnesses to Sarah's murder. As they continued north through the Colorado mountains, Marcus shared more details about Victor's organization that painted a picture of methodical brutality spanning decades. The criminal network included corrupt officials in 3 states, judges who could make evidence disappear, and forensic specialists who could stage crime scenes that would fool even experienced investigators. Victor's greatest strength is his patience, Marcus explained, as they navigated the winding mountain roads. He plans operations years in advance, establishes multiple backup scenarios, and never moves until he's certain of success. The fact that he's acting now, after 20 years of careful monitoring, means he believes the threat to his organization is existential. The threat was existential, Jed realized. The evidence in their briefcase could dismantle Victor's entire network, expose criminal activities spanning multiple decades, and implicate wealthy families throughout the region who'd used his services to solve their problems permanently. But that same evidence made them targets for elimination by an organization that had perfected the art of making problems disappear. As they approached the Montana border, Catherine's phone rang with an update from Agent Chen that made everyone's blood run cold. Local law enforcement in Millfield has found Sheriff Morton's patrol car abandoned on a back road, with signs of a struggle, but no body. They're treating it as a kidnapping, but given the federal investigation, we have to assume he's being held as leverage against your cooperation. The implication was clear. Victor's team had Bill Morton, and they would use him to force Jed into a position where he had to choose between his friend's life and justice for Sarah. It was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation that had kept Marcus and Catherine silent for 20 years. The threat of violence against innocent people used to maintain compliance with criminal demands. But this time would be different. This time, they had evidence that could bring down the entire organization, federal agents who were finally taking the threat seriously, and most importantly, they had run out of places to hide. The mountain sanctuary that had been Jed's refuge for 2 decades was about to become the battleground where 20 years of buried secrets would finally surface. As they crested the final pass before descending into the Bitterroot Valley, Jed could see smoke rising from the direction of his property. Either Victor's men were already there, or something had gone terribly wrong with the federal response. Either way, the quiet life he'd built among the pines was about to end in fire and violence, with the fate of everyone he cared about hanging In the balance, the last artifact of his old life was about to be his willingness to fight for justice, no matter the cost. Sarah Elizabeth Rourke had been dead for 20 years, but her story was about to be told in a way that would shake the foundations of the criminal empire built on her grave. Boone sensed the tension in the truck, pressing close to Jed's side. As they descended toward whatever waited in the valley below, the dog had been with him when they'd discovered Sarah's remains, and now he would be with him when they finally confronted the people responsible for putting her there. It was time to stop running from the past and start fighting for the future. Smoke rising from Jed's property wasn't coming from his cabin. It was coming from the forest clearing where Sarah's bones had been discovered. As they approached through the back roads that Jed knew better than any map, the scope of Victor's operation became terrifyingly clear. Professional surveillance equipment had been set up in strategic positions. Armed men in tactical gear moved through the trees with military precision, and at the center of it all, someone was systematically burning evidence. Jed pulled his truck off the main road and into a hunting trail that would bring them within a quarter-mile of his property without being detected. Marcus and Catherine followed in their sedan, both vehicles hidden beneath the canopy of ancient pines that had provided sanctuary for so many years and were now serving as cover for what might be their final stand. Through binoculars that had served him well during 2 decades of solitary life, Jed surveyed the tactical situation with the eye of a man who'd learned to read the mountains like a book. Victor's team had positioned themselves to control all the obvious approaches to his cabin, but they'd made the classic mistake of outsiders in the wilderness. They'd underestimated the terrain and overestimated their equipment. 6 men that I can see, Jed whispered to Marcus, who crouched beside him behind a fallen log that provided perfect concealment. Professional gear, but they're operating like they're in an urban environment. They don't understand how sound carries in these mountains or how the wind patterns work. In the clearing where Sarah had been buried, 2 men in hazmat suits were methodically destroying evidence with industrial incinerators that had been hauled up the mountain in vehicles that were now parked in Jed's former garden. The bone fragments, the artifacts, even the soil itself was being eliminated with the thoroughness that spoke of decades of practice in making problems disappear permanently. But it was the sight of Bill Morton that made Jed's blood run cold. His old friend was bound to a tree near the cabin, clearly alive but bearing signs of interrogation that suggested Victor's men had been working to extract information about the federal investigation. Bill's presence confirmed what Jed had suspected. This wasn't just about eliminating evidence, it was about eliminating everyone who knew the truth about Sarah's murder. There, Catherine whispered, pointing toward a figure who stood apart from the others, directing the operation with the calm authority of someone accustomed to command. Victor Kozlov himself had come to Montana to oversee the cleanup, a testament to how seriously he took the threat posed by their evidence. Victor was smaller than Jed had expected, a compact man in his 60s who carried himself with the dangerous stillness of a predator. Even at a distance, there was something unsettling about his presence, an aura of controlled violence that explained how he'd built and maintained a criminal empire spanning multiple decades. "He never comes to operations personally," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "The fact that he's here means he considers this existential to his organization." Their tactical assessment was interrupted by the arrival of additional vehicles, black SUVs that wound up the mountain road with the careful precision of a professional convoy. Through his binoculars, Jed could see the FBI tactical team that Agent Chen had promised, but they were moving into a situation that had been carefully prepared by an enemy who'd had years to study the terrain and plan contingencies. They're walking into a trap, Jed realized, watching as Victor's men adjusted their positions to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the mountain road into a killing zone. Victor's been planning for federal intervention. He's going to eliminate the FBI team along with all the witnesses. The pieces of Victor's strategy became clear as Jed studied the tactical situation. The criminal organization couldn't simply eliminate the Rourke family and their evidence. They had to eliminate the federal agents who were investigating them as well. By drawing everyone to this remote location, Victor could stage a firefight that would result in the deaths of all the witnesses and investigators, then clean up the scene so thoroughly that the truth about Sarah's murder would be buried forever. But Victor had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Jed Rourke was still the same man who'd fled from family conflict 20 years ago, a reluctant participant who would prefer negotiation to confrontation. He didn't understand that 2 decades in the wilderness had forged a different kind of man. Someone who knew every stone and tree on this mountain. Someone who'd learned to think like the predators he'd shared the forest with. Someone who'd been preparing for this confrontation without even knowing it. The evidence briefcase sat between Marcus and Catherine like a loaded weapon, containing information that could destroy Victor's organization if it reached the right people. But first, they had to survive long enough to deliver it, and that meant turning Victor's carefully planned ambush into something he'd never experienced. A fair fight on terrain that favored the defender. As the FBI convoy approached, the killing zone that Victor had prepared, Jed made a decision that would either save everyone he cared about or get them all killed. He was going to turn the hunter into the hunted, using every advantage that 20 years of mountain living had given him. The battle for Sarah's justice was about to begin. Jed's plan formed with the clarity that comes from understanding terrain, like your own heartbeat. While Victor's men had positioned themselves to control the obvious approaches, they'd ignored the network of game trails, seasonal streams, and natural cover that Jed had been using for 20 years. Most importantly, they'd failed to account for Boone, whose ability to move silently through the forest made him the perfect scout and early warning system. "I'm going to create a distraction," Jed whispered to Marcus and Catherine, checking the hunting rifle that had fed him through countless winters. "When the shooting starts, you take the evidence briefcase and follow that stream bed down the mountain. It'll bring you to the main road about 2 miles south of here, where Agent Chen's backup team should be waiting." Catherine gripped his arm with surprising strength. "You can't face all of them alone. Victor's men are professionals." "So was I once," Jed replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his purpose again after 20 years of exile. "And they're fighting on my mountain now." The first phase of his counterattack involved something Victor's urban-trained team couldn't have anticipated: the mountain itself. Jed knew that the seasonal creek running behind his cabin could be diverted with carefully placed obstacles, turning the clearing where Victor's men had positioned their command post into a muddy quagmire that would slow their movements and ruin their expensive equipment. Working his way through the forest with Boone at his side, Jed reached the small dam he'd built years ago to create a swimming hole during the summer months. A few minutes with his camping shovel, and the accumulated water was rushing down the mountainside toward Victor's carefully planned ambush site. The effect was immediate and devastating. The industrial incinerators, still burning evidence in the clearing where Sarah had been buried, were suddenly surrounded by rushing water that turned their sophisticated operation into chaos. Men in tactical gear found themselves slipping and sliding through mud that made their military precision worthless, while electronic surveillance equipment sparked and died as water reached sensitive components. But Victor himself proved why. He'd survived decades in a profession where most men died young. Instead of panicking at the unexpected setback, he immediately adapted his strategy, using hand signals to reposition his men for the new tactical situation. Within minutes, he transformed his evidence destruction operation into a defensive perimeter that could still threaten the approaching FBI convoy. That's when Jed implemented the second phase of his plan, one that relied on intimate knowledge of how sound carried through these particular mountains. From a position high above the main clearing, he began making the calls that had served him well during hunting season, mimicking the distress cries of various animals that would draw predators to investigate. To Victor's men, it sounded like random forest noise, but to the FBI tactical team approaching on the main road, it was clearly a human signal, someone trying to communicate their position without revealing themselves to the enemy. Agent Chen, listening through radio intercepts, recognized the pattern immediately and began adjusting her team's approach to take advantage of the intelligence Jed was providing. The real battle began when Victor realized he was facing not just federal agents, but someone who understood both military tactics and wilderness survival better than his own team. The evidence destruction operation abandoned, he repositioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire that would pin down any attackers while he attempted to extract his forces from what had become an untenable position. But Jed had one more advantage that 20 years of solitary living had given him: patience. While Victor's men grew increasingly nervous about their deteriorating tactical situation, Jed waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when the FBI team, guided by his animal calls, established their own perimeter and began closing in from multiple directions. With Boone serving as his silent partner, Jed moved through the forest like the shadow he'd become, using his hunting rifle to eliminate Victor's sentries one by one. Each shot was precisely placed, each movement calculated to avoid detection by the remaining members of Victor's team. 20 years of hunting in these mountains had taught him how to kill cleanly and efficiently, skills that translated perfectly to hunting more dangerous prey. The final confrontation came in the clearing where Sarah's bones had been discovered, where Victor made his last stand beside the smoldering remains of the evidence he'd tried so desperately to destroy. Surrounded by FBI agents and facing a mountain man who'd spent 2 decades preparing for this moment without knowing it, the criminal who'd terrorized the Rourke family for 20 years finally understood that some debts demand payment in full. As Victor raised his hands in surrender, his eyes met Jed's across the clearing where a child had been buried with such care so many years ago. In that moment, both men understood that justice for Sarah Elizabeth Rourke had finally arrived, carried on the mountain wind that had kept her secrets for 2 decades and was now ready to speak her truth to the world. The battle was over, but the real work of healing was just beginning. 6 months after Victor Kozlov's arrest in the mountain clearing where Sarah Elizabeth Rourke had been buried, Jed stood in the same spot holding a different kind of artifact, a bronze plaque that would mark her final resting place with the dignity she'd been denied in life. The federal investigation had concluded, the criminal organization had been dismantled, and the truth about a 20-year-old murder had finally been told in open court. The plaque was simple but elegant, bearing Sarah's name, her dates of birth and death, and a single line that captured the essence of her brief life: beloved daughter whose truth set many free. Below that, in smaller letters, were the words Jed had insisted upon: her story lives on in the mountain wind. Bill Morton stood beside him, his arm still in a sling from his ordeal with Victor's men, but his spirit undaunted by the experience. The sheriff had become something of a local hero for his role in preserving evidence that proved crucial to the federal prosecution, and his department had received commendations from agencies across 3 states for their cooperation in bringing down one of the region's most dangerous criminal organizations. "You sure you want to do this?" Bill asked, watching as Jed prepared to install the memorial marker in the exact spot where Boone had first begun digging 6 months ago. "A lot of folks would want to forget this place after everything that happened." "Here, that's exactly why it needs to be remembered," Jed replied, using a small shovel to dig holes for the marker's posts. "Sarah deserves to have her story told, and this is where it began and ended. Forgetting won't bring her back, but remembering might prevent other children from suffering the same fate." The legal proceedings had been swift once Agent Chen's task. Force had the evidence Marcus and Catherine had assembled over 20 years. Victor Kozlov pled guilty to multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy in exchange for a life sentence without parole. His organization had been systematically dismantled, with corrupt officials at every level facing their own reckonings with justice. The Rourke family's business empire had been largely dissolved, its assets used to compensate Victor's victims and fund programs for families affected by organized crime. Marcus and Catherine had both received significant prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy, but their cooperation with federal authorities had earned them the possibility of parole in 15 years. They'd used their time in custody to work with victim advocates, helping other families who'd been trapped by criminal organizations understand their options for escape and recovery. David Rourke, Sarah's biological father, had been devastated to learn the truth about his daughter's fate. Now 39 years old and a father of 3 children with his wife, he'd established a foundation in Sarah's memory that provided legal assistance to immigrant families facing exploitation by wealthy employers. Elena Vasquez's family had finally learned the truth about her disappearance, and her remains had been recovered from a location Victor had revealed as part of his plea agreement. As Jed finished installing the memorial marker, Boone trotted over to investigate the new addition to their mountain home. The dog had adapted well to the increased human activity on the property. Federal agents, victim advocates, and journalists had all made pilgrimages to the site where a child's buried truth had brought down a criminal empire. But now that the legal proceedings were complete and the media attention had faded, life was returning to something resembling the peaceful routine Jed had cultivated for 20 years. The difference was that this peace felt earned rather than simply escaped into. For 2 decades, he'd believed that isolation could protect him from his family's corruption, but Sarah's discovery had taught him that some battles can't be avoided. They can only be delayed until the cost of fighting becomes greater than the cost of surrender. Agent Chen visited occasionally, updating him on the ongoing investigations that had spun off from Victor's arrest. The criminal network had tentacles reaching into organizations across the Mountain West, and dismantling it completely would take years of careful police work. But the foundation had been broken, and the culture of fear that had kept families, like the Rourkes silent for decades, was finally beginning to crumble. "You ever think about writing a book about all this?" Bill asked as they walked back toward Jed's rebuilt cabin. The structure had been damaged during the final confrontation with Victor's men, but Jed had used the insurance settlement to build something better, a home that reflected not just his need for solitude, but his newfound